Everyone is talking about Juanita Bynum's recent disclosure regarding Bishop T.D. Jakes. And believe me, the church community wasn't prepared for this. The information she revealed has left viewers utterly stunned, igniting debate, posing queries, and making them reevaluate their connection. What had she actually disclosed? And why is this fundamentally upending the religious community? Stay with me because what you're going to hear will permanently alter your perception of T.D. Jakes and Juanita Bynum. Bishop T.D. Jakes and Juanita Bynum have long been two of the most well-known and significant figures in contemporary ministry. Millions of people around the world have been influenced by their publications, sermons, and appearances. However, there have always been murmurs beneath the stirring speeches and crowded auditoriums. Whispers regarding their actual interactions. Whispers about events that the general public was unaware of, and about discoveries that have the potential to completely alter the course of events. We are delving deeply into Juanita Bynum's startling disclosure regarding T.D. Jakes in today's video. Her followers have been taken aback by this revelation, which has also caused significant doubt in the religious world. You won't believe the little-known facts that link their background, the battles that went on behind the scenes but were never completely revealed, and the shocking revelation that Juanita decided to make public at last. Together, we will examine their historical timeline over the course of the next few chapters, go over the breakthroughs and disputes that shaped their ministries, and then focus on the revelation that has left so many people stunned. We'll reveal the potentially most contentious aspect of her confession just when you think you've heard it all. This isn't just another church headline, so have a seat. This is a tale of truth, treachery, loyalty, power, and suffering. And believe me, it gets more severe the more we peel back. You'll view Juanita Bynum, T.D. Jakes, and the reality of what goes on behind the pulpit after the lights go off quite differently after watching this film. Let's start at the beginning, since we must first review Juanita's complex yet significant past with Bishop T.D. Jakes in order to fully comprehend the significance of her discovery. We must go back to the late 1990s and early 2000s, when Juanita Bynum's ascent to prominence in ministry was nothing short of extraordinary. In order to fully understand the significance of her latest revelation, Juanita Bynum was more than a preacher in search of her calling. For millions of people who felt ignored or stifled in their faith, she was fearless, fervent, and incredibly empathetic. Bishop T.D. Jakes was already solidifying his reputation as one of the world's most powerful pastors at this time. Jakes had established a worldwide reputation that extended well beyond the boundaries of the church, thanks to his best-selling books and successful conferences like Woman, Thou Art Loose. He was a movement more than merely a preacher, and Juanita Bynum's ministry found a springboard within this enormous movement. Their early relationship wasn't a coincidence. Juanita was the ideal voice to magnify Jakes' vision because of her unvarnished honesty, fiery delivery, and capacity to empathize with women who were shattered or looking for healing. Her participation in the Woman Thou Art Loosed conference was one of the pivotal events in her career. Here, Juanita not only became well known, but also started speaking up for women who were being mistreated, ignored, or wounded. People were compelled to listen to her because of the genuineness of her statements. This was more than simply a business relationship. At the time, Juanita and T.D. Jakes stood for a strong partnership, a lady with a message and a guy with an empire. Collectively, they attracted sizable audiences and controlled discussions throughout the religious community. As two preachers whose paths were divinely matched to reach souls in ways few could, they were perceived by the public as a dynamic force rather than necessarily as partners. This is where things become fascinating, though. The public witnessed crowded arenas, participants' tears, and life-altering words. But behind the scenes, things weren't always so flawless. Tensions, arguments, and discussions that alluded to more serious difficulties were all present. Some of those years were both the most powerful and the most difficult of Juanita's life. As she would later recall, along with her fame came criticism. She created adversaries as well as influence. Her indisputable link to Bishop T.D. Jakes and his platform persisted throughout it all. Many contended that Juanita's ascent might have been slower or less significant in the absence of Jake's influence. However, some claim that Juanita's ferocity, openness, and genuineness were what made Jake's talks even more relatable. What actually transpired during those formative years of connection then? Was it just a convenient partnership? Was a more profound mentorship involved? Or were tensions already being sown, which would eventually grow into the startling disclosure Juanita just made? This is where the narrative starts to change. Because when you peel back the layers, what appeared to be a flawless alignment on the outside was far more intricate. Later on, Juanita herself would talk about specific events at this time in her life that had a lasting impact on how she perceived ministry and relationships in the church. The world began to see a new face of women in the pulpit as Juanita Bynum's ministry continued to grow. She wasn't the usual quiet person concealed in the background on platforms dominated by men. No, Juanita had a rawness that went right to the heart and was unabashedly brazen. Her sermons shocked people, not simply gave them encouragement. Juanita was well known in Christian circles by the early 2000s. Her revolutionary lecture, "No More Sheets," was one of her most memorable moments. Delivered with ferocious passion, the message was more than simply mere words. There was a movement. Women from all over came to hear her talk about relationships, deliverance, pain, and the silent issues that many were unwilling to publicly address. Juanita's reputation skyrocketed after the sermon, and she became one of the most sought-after female preachers worldwide. However, quick success frequently brings with it new difficulties. The initial indications of conflict between Juanita and Bishop T.D. Jakes are said to have started at this point. Recall that Jake was already a powerful figure who was revered and appreciated for his abilities to establish an empire as well as his preaching. Juanita was viewed by many as his protege and the result of his influence. She quickly started to stand as a force all by herself, though. A few members of the church community started murmuring. Was Jake's own platform in danger of being eclipsed by her influence? Was she becoming too large too quickly in a society that wasn't quite prepared to accept a female preacher on this scale? Both Jake and Bynum remained professional in public. However, people with knowledge of the issue indicate that the dynamic was changing. Although neither of them explicitly acknowledged it, what had formerly been perceived as mentorship now appeared to be a power battle. As Juanita's star grew, rumors, envy, and scrutiny followed. Juanita's detractors began to accuse her of being overly devoted to her celebrity, overly commercial, and overly vocal. Others supported her, arguing that she was just dismantling long-standing hurdles intended to prevent women from advancing. In the meantime, T.D. Jake remained in control of the scene, but it was getting more and more difficult to distinguish Juanita's personality from the shadow of his influence. Cracks started to appear behind the scenes. Now, their shared experiences were recalled more for the tension that was not expressed than for the sermons that were given. According to insiders, there were disputes over visibility, direction, and the amount of space Juanita was occupying on platforms that Jake had constructed. This is where it becomes even more fascinating. Later on, Juanita would allude to the fact that she started to see aspects of ministry and even of people she trusted that would have a significant influence on her spiritual development. Although she didn't explain everything at the time, the seeds were sown. Roots of hurt and disappointment that would eventually grow into the very realization we are discussing now. It was more than just triumph that marked the turning moment. Identity was at issue. Juanita had evolved beyond her role as a preacher at Jake's conferences. She was Juanita Bynum, a voice from around the world, a woman who sold out arenas by herself. But there was a cost to that ascent. Furthermore, the earliest indications of conflict foreshadowed more significant conflicts. Because behind closed doors, the power dynamics between T.D. Jake and Juanita Bynum were shifting. Even as the public witnessed revival services, best-selling books, and broadcast lectures. And those adjustments would result in times when none of them could fully conceal. Here's the startling bit, though. This went beyond ministry development and professional trajectories. The season became even more complex because Juanita was dealing with personal scars, emotional struggles, and traumatic events all at once. This leads us to the section that changed her story forever. Every rising star ultimately experiences a time when life itself, not a lack of skill, dims the brilliance. That tipping point for Juanita Bynum was marked by highly publicized scandals, intensely personal hardships, and a degree of publicity she never anticipated. In addition to preaching to crowded churches, Juanita was selling books, producing gospel music, and making appearances on popular television by the middle of the 2000s. From the outside, her ministry appeared to be at its height. Her personal life, meanwhile, was starting to fall apart behind the scenes. When it was revealed in 2007 that Juanita had been physically abused by her former husband, Bishop Thomas Weeks III, it was the most shocking and devastating event. There were no whispers about the event, which took place in a hotel parking lot. It garnered national attention. Suddenly, one of the most influential women in ministry was being viewed through the eyes of a victim as images of Juanita's bruises went viral. Not just a personal tragedy occurred here. The spectacle was open to the public. Her marriage, her decisions, and even her position as a woman in leadership were the subject of discussion, criticism, and conjecture. Some sent prayers and sympathy. Some were cruel, accusing her of not being as holy as she claimed to be. Juanita found herself in the midst of the severe judgment of the ecclesiastical world, which may be cruel at times. Despite the agony, she managed to transform it into a testimony. She started talking candidly about brokenness, domestic abuse, and the unsaid burdens that women in the pews were bearing. However, this is the section that has a direct connection to T.D. Jake. Many people anticipated Jake, who was formerly viewed as an ally and mentor, to bravely support her during this crisis. Instead, though, many observed a lack of communication, a sense of distance, and an absence that begged for explanation. Why didn't Bishop Jake show more overt support? He once magnified the woman's ministry. Why didn't he intervene to defend or publicly support her? Was public solidarity difficult because of underlying tensions between them, or was it just a question of safeguarding his own reputation? These queries persisted, and they fueled speculation that their romance had deteriorated long before Juanita's private problems made news. It appeared to be abandonment to some. Others saw it as evidence that the ministry community was more divided than it seemed from the pulpit. However, that was not the end of the breaking point. Juanita experienced financial difficulties, teaching-related controversies, and even criticism for the decisions she took in reconstructing her ministry following her divorce. She was accused by some of becoming overly dramatic. Others questioned her way of life. Others said she had been used, thrown away, and left to pick herself up without the help of people she had previously trusted. This is where things start to get chilly. Juanita would subsequently imply that the harsh condemnation from the church and her broken marriage weren't the only things causing her pain during this time. It was also about powerful people who had abandoned her, people she had previously looked up to, trusted, and even given credit for. Even though she didn't always mention names, Bishop T.D. Jake's shadow was very much there in those unsaid statements. Fans started to question, as it was obvious that something had changed. Did she mean to keep quiet about Jake's? Did she have a narrative she wasn't ready to tell? Or was the reality just at the moment too contentious for the world to accept? This threshold was almost reached. However, it also prepared the way for, since insight frequently emerges from suffering, the revelation that would come years later would leave everyone in disbelief. Clarity, for Juanita, meant at last speaking the truth about events she had kept hidden for years. Prior to her revelation, however, we must comprehend how she recovered from the storm and how the lessons she received during that trying time changed the way she viewed ministry, authority, and the people she had held in the highest respect. Following the storms of public scrutiny, heartache, and scandal, many people thought Juanita Bynum's ministry was over. Her reputation was damaged, the headlines cruel, and the criticism unrelenting. Her detractors saw her as just another preacher who had fallen from grace because she had gotten too close to the spotlight. They were unaware, however, that Juanita Bynum had no desire to fade into obscurity in silence. Rather, she started a process of reconstruction that would reshape her voice, identity, and ultimately her truth. Transparency was the first step toward her redemption. Juanita leaned into her problems, in contrast to many leaders who attempt to conceal or downplay them. She was candid about her marital dissolution, the mistreatment she experienced, her financial struggles, and even her struggles with self-esteem. By doing this, she took back control and changed the focus from victimization to triumph. It wasn't simple. Churches occasionally hesitated to hire her because they were worried about the stigma associated with her name. Some detractors said that she ought to completely leave the ministry. Juanita, however, resisted letting the negativity control her course. She persisted, gradually winning back the confidence of those who identified with her inspirational tale of tenacity. She resumed writing, started her own seminars, and produced music. As someone who had not only preached about storms but also experienced them firsthand, her messages had a new depth and rawness. Her scars gave her strength, and women who had previously listened to her with adoration now listened with solidarity. It was more than just ministry, though. Additionally, Juanita started to reinterpret what healing meant to her. She pursued treatment, investigated more profound spiritual practices, and surrounded herself with people who supported her development rather than took advantage of her suffering. This period of atonement served as evidence of both her metamorphosis and survival. Nevertheless, the specter of her previous relationships lingered even as she climbed once more. She appeared to be followed everywhere by one name in particular, T.D. Jakes Bishop. Their public relationship was indelible, their history was indisputable, and their silence toward one another was deafening. Churchgoers and viewers frequently wondered if they would publicly reconcile. Would she ever tell him the truth about their relationship? Or would she never be able to open this chapter of her life? Juanita decided not to confront it head-on for years. She concentrated on restoring and demonstrating her independence without the support or endorsement of others. However, her voice became bolder as her ministry steadied and her confidence increased. She started making subliminal clues in sermons and interviews. There were hints that her quiet was due to timing rather than forgetting. At this point, the narrative becomes even more captivating. For Juanita, redemption was more than simply getting back on her feet. It also involved facing realities she had long concealed. In an interview, she once remarked, "Sometimes you have to walk through the fire before you can tell the truth about the flames." Her words alone caused many people to wonder if she was referring to her experiences with her marriage and with people she had previously referred to as allies in ministry. Juanita used her journey to redemption to prepare her audience for the day when she would address the more profound issues. In addition to preaching survival, the shattered alliances, the withheld support, and the agonizing silences that molded her path. Finally, that day arrived. Following years of rumors, conjecture, and unresolved inquiries, Juanita Bynum finally spoke up and shocked her audience by disclosing information regarding T.D. Jake. However, we must first look at the events leading up to that point before we can determine exactly what she said. The cost of speaking up at last, the pressure from the church community, and the reasons she kept quiet for so long. Juanita Bynum eventually came to the conclusion that holding back was no longer an option after years of quiet, conjecture, and unresolved questions. She recently revealed information about Bishop T.D. Jake in a message that went viral on social media, leaving viewers in disbelief and unsure of what to do. There was no fanfare or prior notice for the moment. Unexpectedly, it was weaved into a message about trust, healing, and the wounds caused by treachery. With the rawness of someone who has held pain for too long, Juanita spoke. Furthermore, her remarks were incisive enough to pierce years of conjecture. She disclosed that she felt abandoned by the people she trusted most in ministry during the worst times of her life, when she needed help the most, when her name was dragged through the mud, and when her spirit was almost broken. She made it plain that Bishop T. Jakes was one of those individuals, even though she never intended to bring anyone down. Juanita clarified that although the world believed their loyalty bound them together, the truth was far more nuanced. Behind the curtain, she talked about times when she felt alone because of the silence, the distance, and the lack of support. The church community was rocked by her statement. It's one thing to be broken by your enemies, but it's another to be broken by those who once called you family. The emotion she evoked, in addition to the name she invoked, was what gave this discovery its potency. The years of suppressed disappointment were visible to the audience. It validated long-held fears about animosity between the two leaders, according to some. For others, it brought up awkward issues of ministry politics, image, and allegiance. The dispute grew more intense at this point. Juanita did not present her disclosure as an assault. Rather, she characterized it as a liberation, a choice to speak her mind and at last free herself from the weight of quiet. Her remarks, however, revealed to many listeners the grim reality of what goes on behind the pulpit. Power frequently triumphs over compassion, friendships break down, and alliances change. The effect was instantaneous. Thousands of responses flooded in when clips of her statement started making the rounds on the internet. Some praised her bravery, describing her openness as therapeutic for people who had also experienced abandonment during their worst hours. Others questioned her timing, saying she was revisiting old wounds or creating needless drama. Others questioned what this would mean for T.D. Jakes' standing in light of his widespread influence and esteemed position. The message Juanita conveyed, rather than the name she used, was possibly the most significant aspect of her revelation. She reminded her audience that even the most revered individuals may let us down, that spiritual leaders are human, and that often the people we rely on the most are the ones who abandon us when we falter. Juanita's path and the broader discussion about accountability in the church both underwent significant changes at this time. Her statements made people face hard realities. Do we hold leaders in such high regard that we overlook their quiet when they are needed? Do we put appearance above empathy? Most importantly, are we open to hearing the unvarnished, unadulterated accounts of people who have endured betrayal? Juanita Bynum's disclosure regarding Bishop T.D. Jakes was more than just a private admission. It served as a mirror to the religious community, asking us to reconsider the price of keeping quiet, the burden of loyalty, and the bravery required to speak the truth at last.